This is the story of my father, Bob Brown Sr.'s service in World War II. I always called him Daddy. However, as you will see, the story cannot be told without including my mom, who played a big part in the story. Daddy was drafted in March 1942, just 3 months after Pearl Harbor. He was assigned to the Army Air Force and was sent to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, Missouri for basic training. He was co-owner of Brown Chevrolet Company in Lyons, Georgia with his brother Jack. Because he had had 2 years of college, he was placed in the Quartermaster Corps. And in a short time, he had oversight of managing supplies and equipment in country and overseas for the war effort. This is my mother, Catherine Nelson. Daddy had already been in love with my mother for a year. She was a high school teacher in Lyons, and being drafted threw a monkey wrench into their plans. This is a quick timeline overview of Daddy's service. I show this now to make just 2 points at this point. Daddy spent 3 years, 10 months, and 2 days in the Army Air Force. The second point is that during this time, he wrote 111 letters to her. These are some of the most beautiful letters that any man has ever written to the woman he loved. I have all of these letters shown in this shot. The contents reveal much of their thoughts about the war, how it would affect their relationship, and decisions they would make along the way. Jefferson Barracks was 740 miles from Lyons. Daddy was away from Mother, and he was full of anxiety about what the war would bring to them and the country as well. Jefferson Barracks was quickly expanded in World War II. It had been named as a tribute to former President Thomas Jefferson. When Daddy took us on a family trip to California in 1957, we came back through St. Louis and visited Jefferson Barracks. Daddy went on a writing spree after he started training. He couldn't leave the base for several weeks. He was often on KP duty. These are some of the things he wrote as time progressed. In March 1942, between I love you and want to see you, he says, nobody seems to know what they're doing and where I will be going. This is sort of the chaos as the U.S. was trying to get their act together in responding to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Again in March 1942, he says, I don't know how long this war will last or what will happen to me. Should you forget about me and find someone else? In June, he says, you're the only person I will ever want to marry, and I would marry you now if it were not for the war. September 1942, I think they decided they were going to get married. I'm getting you an engagement ring and a wedding ring together, and I will mail them both to you in Lyons. In November 1942, I have a furlough to come home and marry you. So Bob and Catherine Brown, shown here, they married 8 months after his induction. They went on a 3-day honeymoon to Florida, but only made it to Brunswick, Georgia. Daddy got called back to St. Louis. More letters. December 1942, Daddy writes, can you ask the school principal to find a replacement for you? January 1943, he says there is a lady on the base who wants to interview you for a job. In February 1943, he says we will look for a place to rent off base, but you can start at the Statler Hotel. Well, I looked up information on the Statler Hotel, and this is where Mother stayed for a short time before they found an apartment. And this was the country's first air-conditioned hotel and a model of elegance. It is now the Marriott St. Louis Grand Hotel. This is where Mother and Daddy rented an apartment, 3925 Castleman Avenue in St. Louis. You can see it here on the right. It looks like it hasn't maybe changed much since 1943, 1944. I mentioned that Mother had an interview for a job, and it looks like she got one. In fact, I know she did. She got a job with McDonnell Aircraft on Lambert Field in St. Louis. Now, with McDonnell Aircraft, a Mother who had studied mathematics at GSCW in Milledgeville had actually taken calculus 1, 2, and 3. She could not be an engineer, but she did do math calculations for engineers on the McDonnell Douglas Phantom FH-1 jet plane. This was the first jet plane, a top secret project that was the first to be able to take off and land on an aircraft carrier. My mother was the inspiration for me to become an engineer later on. After they had been in St. Louis for about a year together, they got moved to Big Springs, Texas. It's an Army Air Force base. They moved there about February 1944. They had thought that they would be permanent party for the duration of the war, but they weren't here for long. They had decided at this point to have a child, and I understand that I was conceived in June of 1944. This slide shows the reason that Daddy had to be shipped to the Pacific Theater. It shows the Japanese expansion into China and what was called Indochina. The Chinese were our allies in World War II, and the allies were wanting to ship supplies into China to help Chiang Kai-shek. The US had to find a way to supply the nationalist Chinese led by Chiang Kai-shek because the Burma Road was blocked by the Japanese. Just about all of this area was taken over by Japan, and we were trying to get supplies into coming China. The Burma Road was blocked off. Other avenues had been blocked off. So they had to fly from India to coming China over the Himalayas. This is the ship I believe my daddy took from Los Angeles to Bombay, India. Daddy told me stories about almost everyone getting seasick. He said the mess hall was a real mess. Now, this is the route that Dad took from Los Angeles. He had to sail below Australia because of the presence of the Japanese between Australia and Indochina. This is a long journey. And he had 2 port stops in Australia, actually in Tasmania, which was part of Australia, and then another port stop in Fremantle, Australia. And then he continued to Bombay, India, which is now called Mumbai. From Bombay, India, he took a troop train across India to Calcutta. This is one of Daddy's camps in India, not far from the airfield where he would take a plane over the Himalayas. This was called flying the Hump. Daddy slept in tents in India and had to watch for cobras when he got up in the morning. The poverty in India was the worst he had seen. Now this basically shows you the Hump route from India to Kunming, China. And this is where Daddy would then take, I'll show you on another slide, supplies up to the Chinese up in Luchao. The plane that Daddy generally took was the Curtiss C-46 Commando. This is a photo of it. And here is a short video on the operations.
We called it Flying the Hump. Here over Calcutta, India, we got an idea of how much our sky wagons were slated to carry. There was plenty, tons of food and medicine, tons of gasoline and bombs, shiploads of them every day. Even this was only a fraction of what would come. After a year of operation by the 10th Air Force, we had grown from a squadron of 10 borrowed transports to a fleet of 140 high-altitude C-46s and 47s. Stretching before us were 500 miles of rough duty. Before it was over, the treacherous Hump had cost us 250 transports, 250 cargoes, and 800 airmen. A high price to pay for the privilege to fly over the highest mountains in the world. We flew continuously, some of the time through Jap fighters and treacherous weather. The clouds made pretty pictures, but at 20,000 feet they could mean ice and death. No emergency landing fields among saw-toothed 5-mile-high peaks for us aerial truck drivers. Flying without fighter cover, it was always good to hear we were on the beam and minutes from landing at Kunming, China.
In December of 1943, the India-China wing carried slightly over 6,000 tons. Before the war's end, ATC had airlifted more than 1 million tons of supplies and 1 million troops over the Hump. With the help of Army Airways communication system, flights eventually averaged 1 plane every minute and a half. Peak airlift was reached in July 1945, 71,000 tons in 1 month, including a fleet of jeeps. Every 4 tons of gasoline delivered used 3.5 tons to get them there. Despite the hazards and hardships, despite the costs, the Army Air Forces had conquered the Hump.
This is a side story here that I think is very interesting. Eric Severide was a famous World War II correspondent for CBS. He and several diplomats took the perilous plane trip over the Hump, and their plane lost an engine and crashed in the jungle. They survived, but they had to be rescued. Daddy received a photo of Mother and me when I was born March the 25th, 1945, while he was in China. While he was in China, Mother's Day came, and he sent this from China, Burma, to his mother in Lyons, Georgia. Now here is a Christmas card towards the end of Daddy's stay in China, saying he would take a ship to Seattle, Washington, and arrive back in Lyons about December 24th, Christmas Eve. After Daddy was home, he and Mother began to expand their family, and they added Richard and Ray. my two beloved brothers. This is a summary of the World War II timeline of my father, Bob Brown Sr. in World War II. As we said, he was inducted in March 3rd, 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor. In June of 42, he was promoted to corporal. In September of 42, he was promoted to sergeant. He married my mother, Catherine Nelson, November the 8th. He was promoted to staff sergeant in January of 1943. Mother moved to St. Louis to be with him in March of 1943. And then in about May of 1943, she starts working at McDonnell Aircraft. They moved to Big Springs, Texas in February of 1944, thinking they were going to be permanent party. They decided to have children in June of 1944, but then Daddy had to sail to Bombay, India, on November the 10th. He arrived in Bombay December the 11th. And then in 1945, while he was in China and India, I was born March 25th. Daddy sails back to the U.S. November 25th to Seattle, Washington, and then arrives in the U.S. December 24th. His time in the Army Air Force was 3 years, 10 months, and 2 days. I believe my daddy served his country with distinction in World War II, as he made sure that our troops and allies got the supplies they needed. He did many things and traveled to many places that he never dreamed of. He was awarded 3 Bronze Stars. Daddy, thank you for your service.